The wind cut through the trees like knives, hissing over the open flats and carrying with it the last sounds she remembered. The jeering laughter, the cruel snap of bone, the crunch of boots walking away. She lay in the snow, her breath a ragged mist, her arms useless, her legs screaming with every twitch. The men had left her there on purpose, saying the winter would finish what they started, and for a while she believed them. Her eyelids grew heavy as flakes settled on her lashes, the weight of the cold pulling her into darkness. But somewhere deep inside, a stubborn ember burned. She thought of the small life growing in her belly, the heartbeat she'd felt when she still had the strength to press her palm to it, and she forced her eyes open again. The snow blurred into shadows, moving at the edge of her vision. Something large, four-legged, low to the ground, and watching her with eyes like molten gold. A wolf, its coat thick and flecked with ice, stepped closer, breath steaming in the cold. She expected teeth, but instead it lowered its head and sniffed her, then let out a low, almost questioning whine. Beyond it, a man emerged from the line of pines, broad-shouldered beneath a fur-lined coat, his face half hidden by a beard that looked carved by the wind itself. He froze when he saw her, his gaze dropping to the twisted angles of her arms and legs, then lifting to the wolf standing guard at her side. Slowly he approached, the snow crunching under his boots, his voice low and calm, as if speaking to both of them. "Easy, boy. We'll get her warm." The wolf didn't move as the man knelt, sliding his arms beneath her with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. Pain ripped through her body as he lifted her, but his grip was steady, his chest a solid wall of heat against the wind. The wolf padded ahead, leading them toward the dark line of trees. She could hear the man's heartbeat in the silence between his breaths, could feel his coat's warmth bleeding into her frozen skin, and for the first time since the attack, she let her head rest against someone without fear. Somewhere behind them, snow began to fill the prints left by the men who had abandoned her, but their trail no longer mattered. She was moving away from death now, carried by a stranger whose arms felt like the safest place in the world. The wolf led them through a maze of snow-laden pines until the world seemed to shrink into a silence, broken only by the whisper of falling flakes and the steady crunch of boots. Her vision swam in and out, but she caught glimpses of a small clearing ahead, a squat log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, its roof sagging under the weight of winter. The man pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried her inside, the sudden warmth of the fire making her gasp as feeling returned in painful bursts to her frozen skin. He set her down on a bed layered with thick pelts, his hands lingering just long enough to make sure she didn't slip. The wolf settled by the hearth, watching with alert eyes as the man knelt beside her. In the flickering firelight, she saw him clearly for the first time, his face weathered by years of wind and cold, his eyes the color of storm clouds, and a deep scar running from his temple to his jaw. He spoke little, but his actions were sure. He cut away the frozen cloth from her sleeves, revealing bruises in ugly purples and blacks, then gently splinted her arms with strips of wood wrapped in soft hide. She was trying to form words, her name, a question, when his jaw tightened and his gaze shifted to something behind her. Turning her head, she saw it. Heavy iron shackles, half buried in a corner beneath a pile of firewood, the chains still glistening with frost. A cold dread tightened in her chest. He must have seen her fear because he said, low but firm, "Not mine." He rose, pulling the chains into the light, his grip on them like someone holding a snake they meant to kill. The shackles were too small for a grown man, made for a woman, maybe even a child, and their presence in his cabin was a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. The wolf growled softly, as if sensing the unease. He dropped the chains into the fire without another word, the metal hissing as it met the flames. The smell of scorched iron filled the room, and she realized her hands were trembling. Not from the cold now, but from the thought of whoever had been here before her, and whether they'd left alive. He looked at her then, as though reading the storm in her eyes, and said quietly, "You're safe here. Whoever hurt you, they won't come through that door." But outside, in the stillness of the snow, far-off voices were carried on the wind. Voices that made her know the men who had left her to die were not done with her yet. The voices carried closer, muffled at first, then sharper as the wind shifted, the crunch of boots on frozen ground punctuating each word. She froze on the bed, instinct telling her to make herself small, to vanish into the furs. But the wolf was already on its feet, hackles rising, a low growl rumbling from its chest. The mountain man didn't speak. He simply stood, his massive frame filling the doorway as he reached for the rifle propped against the wall. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing an expression carved from stone, but his eyes, dark, focused, burned with something far more dangerous than fear. "Stay here," he murmured without looking back, his voice low enough that only she and the wolf heard. Then he stepped outside into the white glare of the snow. From where she sat, she could see slivers of movement through the gap in the doorway. 3 figures emerging from the trees, their coats ragged but their rifles polished and ready. She knew those men, even from a distance. They were her husband's kin, cruel in ways that had nothing to do with survival, the kind who thought pain was a form of entertainment. One of them shouted her name like it was a curse, the sound sharp against the still air. The mountain man didn't answer. Instead, the wolf padded out beside him, standing at his flank like a sentry, its golden eyes fixed on the intruders. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward, grinning in a way that made her blood run cold. "We just came for what's ours," he called, voice dripping with mockery. "Ain't no need for trouble, friend." The mountain man's grip on the rifle didn't tighten, but his stance shifted slightly, weight anchored as if he'd been standing guard his whole life. "She's not yours," he said, and the quiet authority in his tone made the other 2 hesitate. The leader laughed, but there was an edge to it now, the kind that came when a man realized he might not be holding all the cards. She wanted to call out, to tell the mountain man to shut the door, to run, but she couldn't make her voice work. The wolf took one deliberate step forward, a low snarl spilling into the silence, and the leader's grin faltered. Snowflakes drifted lazily between them, but the air was charged like lightning before a storm. "You can hand her over," the man said, "or we'll take her." The mountain man's answer was to lift his rifle, not fast, not threatening, just enough to make his meaning clear. And in that quiet moment, she understood something with bone-deep certainty. These men would leave here either empty-handed or not at all. The leader's smirk hardened into something uglier, his gloved hand tightening around the stock of his rifle as if testing the weight. The other 2 shifted uneasily, but their boots held firm in the snow. The wolf's growl deepened, vibrating through the still air like a warning from the earth itself, its breath curling in pale wisps against the cold. The mountain man didn't move, not even when the leader's hand twitched toward his weapon. He stood as if carved from the same stone as the mountains looming in the distance, his gaze unblinking. "Last chance," the leader said, his voice a strained mix of bravado and the creeping realization that this wasn't going the way he'd planned. Then, too fast to think, he jerked his rifle upward, the metallic click of the trigger echoing like a shout. But the mountain man was already moving. The crack of his own rifle split the air, the sound rolling through the trees like thunder. Snow burst from the ground inches from the leader's boots, spraying up in a blinding arc. The message was clear, and it hit harder than a bullet. This was no warning shot for show. This was the kind of precision that meant the next one wouldn't miss. The two men behind him froze, their eyes darting between the wolf's bared teeth and the calm, steady hands holding the rifle. The leader's bravado wavered, but his pride was a stubborn thing. He took a half step forward, opening his mouth to speak, when the wolf lunged, not to attack, but to plant itself directly between the mountain man and the intruders, teeth flashing in the pale light. The snow beneath its paws darkened where blood dripped from its healing flank, yet its stance never faltered. That moment, raw and defiant, seemed to draw the air tight around them. The mountain man lowered his rifle just slightly, enough to speak without the barrel in their faces. "You come closer," he said, his voice steady and low, "and the ground'll take you before you take her." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the leader spat into the snow, his eyes narrowed to slits. "Ain't over," he growled, turning sharply and stalking back toward the trees. The other two followed, but not without casting backward glances filled with both resentment and fear. She sat frozen inside, her fists clenched in the furs, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the crunch of their retreat. When the mountain man stepped back inside, closing the door with slow finality, he didn't look at her right away. Instead, he knelt beside the wolf, running a hand over its fur. "Good," he murmured to it, voice softer than she'd ever heard. And in that moment she realized the danger wasn't gone. It had just been postponed. The night came early in the mountains, a heavy blackness that swallowed the last colors of sunset in minutes, leaving only the faint silver glow of the moon on the snow. Inside the cabin, the fire's light flickered across the log walls, casting long shadows that swayed with every gust of wind rattling the shutters. She sat near the hearth, the heat barely touching the cold that had settled deep inside her bones since the confrontation. The mountain man was silent as he cleaned his rifle, every movement deliberate, the steel glinting in the firelight. The wolf lay stretched out nearby, its breathing steady but ears twitching at every creak in the wood. Then it happened. A sound so faint she almost thought she'd imagined it. A crunch in the snow outside. Then another. Her eyes darted to the mountain man, but he didn't look up. He just set the rifle down and moved toward the door with the slow, quiet tread of a predator. The wolf's head lifted, a low growl rumbling deep in its throat, confirming what she'd feared. They were back. Through a narrow crack in the shutters, she caught the faint shapes moving in the dark. 3 figures, the same as before, but slower now, careful, their silhouettes almost merging with the shadowed tree line. One carried something long and heavy, too long to be just a rifle. The mountain man's voice was a whisper, but it was sharp enough to cut the air. "Stay low. Don't move unless I tell you." Her heart thudded against her ribs as she slid to the floor behind the bed, clutching the thick quilt to her chest, as if it could stop a bullet. The wolf rose, limping slightly, but positioning itself between her and the door, every muscle taut. The crunch of boots on snow grew louder until they stopped just beyond the porch. Silence pressed in from all sides, the kind that feels like the moment before lightning strikes. Then, bang! A single loud crash as the door shuddered under the force of a boot. She gasped, biting it back, her whole body shaking. The second kick splintered the wood near the latch. The mountain man's rifle was already raised, his body angled towards the opening. "You picked the wrong night," he said, voice low but carrying. The wolf growled louder, a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to root her to the floor. The door gave way on the third kick, swinging inward, and in that frozen heartbeat she realized this time they hadn't come to scare him. They'd come to kill him. The door slammed open, snow swirling inside like a ghost rushing in from the night, and the three men filled the frame. Faces twisted with cold, and something darker, eyes locked on the mountain man as if she didn't exist. The leader, a thick-shouldered brute with a scar running from jaw to temple, stepped forward first, gripping a crowbar like it was an extension of his arm. "Should have stayed out of our business," he growled, his breath steaming in the icy air. The mountain man didn't flinch. His rifle barked once, the shot cracking through the room, and the man on the left staggered back into the snow, clutching his leg with a howl. Before the others could react, the wolf lunged forward, not a limping, wounded creature now, but a streak of muscle and teeth, driven by a loyalty older than fear. It hit the scarred man hard, jaws locking around his arm, dragging him sideways as the crowbar clattered to the floor. The third man raised his shotgun, but the mountain man was faster, pivoting and firing again, the blast throwing the intruder backward into the snowdrift outside. She could barely breathe, her heart hammering so loud it felt like it echoed in her ears. The fight spilled out onto the porch, boots slamming against the planks, the wolf snarling and the scarred man shouting curses as he tried to throw the animal off. The mountain man followed, kicking the crowbar away, and drove the butt of his rifle into the attacker's gut, folding him in half before shoving him into the darkness beyond the porch. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wolf's breathing, ragged but steady, and the far-off rustle of the wind in the pines. Then the mountain man returned, snow melting in his beard, the wolf padding at his side, its muzzle stained but eyes bright with a feral satisfaction. He shut the broken door and leaned the rifle against the wall, looking at her for the first time since it began. "They won't be back tonight," he said, and though his voice was calm, there was a finality in it that told her he hadn't just scared them. He'd made sure they'd think twice before ever coming here again. She moved to the wolf, sinking to her knees beside it, running her fingers through its thick fur, feeling the tremor in its body. "You saved us," she whispered, and for the first time since she'd arrived in this cabin, the warmth in her chest didn't come from the fire. It came from knowing she wasn't alone anymore. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine, the firelight flickering across the rough-hewn walls, but she couldn't stop glancing at the door as if the men might return. The mountain man moved quietly, his massive frame somehow not disturbing the stillness, as he checked the rifle, reloaded, and leaned it within arm's reach. The wolf lay near the hearth, its head resting on its paws, breathing slow but shallow, the tremors in its body fading as the warmth soaked in. She sat on the floor beside it, one hand resting in the thick fur, feeling the steady thump of its heartbeat under her palm. "You should sleep," the mountain man said at last, his voice low, like the murmur of the wind through the pines. She shook her head, afraid that if she closed her eyes, the nightmare outside would slip back through the door. Instead, she watched him move about the cabin, every motion purposeful, every sound deliberate, like a man who had long lived with the knowledge that danger could come without warning. The hours stretched, the fire dimming, snow hissing softly against the roof. She tried to read his face, to understand the man who had fought for her without hesitation, who had placed himself between her and violence, as though it were instinct. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice breaking the heavy quiet. He paused, looking at her from across the fire, eyes shadowed but steady. "Because no one else would," he said simply, as if that answer should be enough. And somehow it was. When she rose to fetch another log for the fire, her knees nearly gave way, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. He was there instantly, crossing the room in 2 strides, his arms under her before she could protest, lifting her as though she weighed no more than the wolf at his feet. He carried her to the cot in the corner and eased her down, pulling a thick fur over her. For a moment, he stood there, one hand on the bedpost, watching her with an expression she couldn't name, part guarded, part something else, something she hadn't seen in years. The wolf stirred, pushing itself to its feet, and limped to her side, curling up against the edge of the bed. She buried her fingers in its fur and felt the tension in her body loosen. As sleep finally claimed her, her last thought was that in a single night, the frozen wilderness had given her something she thought she'd lost forever. Safety. Morning came slow, the pale winter sun spilling weak light through the frost-laced window. She awoke to the sound of boots crunching outside, the wolf already on its feet, ears forward, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. The mountain man stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the icy air, one hand resting on the doorframe as he looked out over the snow-draped valley. She pulled the fur tighter around her shoulders and joined him, stepping carefully to the threshold. That's when she saw them. Fresh tracks cutting through the pristine snow, leading straight toward the cabin from the tree line. They were heavy boot prints, deep enough to know more than one man had been there, and they hadn't been made long ago. Her stomach tightened. "They found us," she whispered, the words trembling. He didn't answer right away, only crouched low, studying the tracks, then scanning the ridge beyond. 2, maybe 3, he said at last, his voice low but calm, though his grip on the rifle told a different story. The wolf padded forward, sniffing the air, then looked up at him with an almost human understanding, as if it too knew trouble was close. He turned to her, his eyes steady but urgent. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." The weight of those words sank in. He wasn't speaking like a man who thought the threat might pass. He was speaking like one who knew it wouldn't. She wanted to argue, to tell him she could help, but the truth was she still felt weak, her body aching from the night before. The wolf gave a sharp, impatient bark, the sound snapping in the frozen air, and the mountain man's gaze flicked to the trees again. Without another word, he slung the rifle over his shoulder and stepped out into the snow, his broad figure moving toward the pines until he disappeared into the white. She shut the door, bolted it, and stood there in the silence that followed, every creak of the cabin sounding louder than it should. Minutes stretched, the wolf pacing restlessly, its eyes never leaving the door. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a crow cawed, harsh and unsettling. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening for any sound of his return. But the only thing she heard was the wind shifting. And then, faintly, the crack of a rifle shot. Her heart lurched, her hands clenching at the fur around her. The wolf growled again, deep and warning. She didn't know if that shot meant he was winning, or if it meant he was gone. The wind carried more than snow now. It carried voices. Low, muffled, and close enough that she knew they weren't in the trees anymore. The wolf froze mid-step, its fur bristling, head turning toward the door. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath, listening. The crunch of boots on the frozen ground grew clearer, and then came the heavy knock. 3 slow, deliberate thuds that made the wood shudder. Her pulse roared in her ears. She gripped the kitchen knife with trembling hands, the only weapon she had, though she knew it was no match for whatever stood outside. "Open up," a voice called, deep and mocking. The drawl stretched as if savoring the moment. The wolf's growl rumbled louder, its body angled between her and the door, ready to spring. She stayed silent, praying they might believe no one was home, but the second voice shattered that hope, sharp, impatient. "We saw the smoke. We know she's in there." Her breath caught, They were here for her. She thought of the mountain man out in the snow, of the rifle shot she'd heard earlier, and a cold fear gripped her. What if he was lying out there, motionless beneath the trees? The knock came again, harder this time, the sound splintering in the stillness. The wolf stepped forward, barking, its teeth flashing white. She tightened her grip on the knife, her mind racing for what to do. Then, from outside, came the scrape of metal. Someone testing the latch. "Guess we'll come in ourselves," the first voice said, almost cheerful. The bar across the door shivered as they pushed against it. Her stomach twisted, panic clawing at her, but then another sound cut through the cold air, the unmistakable crunch of boots, heavy, measured, and coming from the other direction. A voice, deeper than the rest, rang out with steel in every syllable. "Step away from the cabin." Her knees nearly buckled at the sound. It was him. The wolf barked sharply, tail stiff with tension, as silence fell outside for a beat too long. Then came the low reply from one of the men, taunting, "And if we don't?" What followed was swift, brutal. A single shot tore through the air, close enough that she flinched. Then came the chaos. Shouts, scuffling, the crack of branches breaking under weight. The wolf lunged for the door, barking with fury. She could hear his voice again, shorter now, commanding, but she couldn't make out the words. And then, just as suddenly, silence. She stood frozen, knife still in hand, waiting to hear who or what would be the one to knock next. The silence outside stretched, thick and heavy, until the latch finally lifted. Not with the clumsy force of intruders, but with a steady, deliberate hand. The door swung open, and there he stood, framed against the swirling snow, his broad shoulders rising and falling with the effort of what had just happened. His coat was dusted white, his rifle still smoking faintly at his side, and at his feet the wolf padded in first, brushing against her legs as if to assure her it was over. Her breath trembled out, and the knife slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. Behind him, two shadowy shapes lay sprawled in the snow, unmoving. He didn't glance back at them. His eyes were only on her, searching, making sure she was whole. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. She tried to speak, but the knot in her throat made the words stick, and instead she stumbled forward. His arms opened without hesitation, and she fell into them, her face pressing against the rough fur lining of his coat, the smell of pine and wood smoke filling her senses. His hands were steady, one cradling the back of her head, the other drawing her close, as if he could shield her from every cruel thing the world had left to throw. For a long moment, neither moved. The wolf stood at their side, watching the door as if guarding them still, its amber eyes alert but softening now that her trembling had eased. She felt the deep thud of his heartbeat against her cheek, the unshakable rhythm grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I thought you wouldn't come back," she whispered finally, the words ragged. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his weathered face lined with something deeper than anger, something like devotion. "I'd cross 100 winters for you," he said simply, and she knew it wasn't a promise made lightly. He guided her towards the fire, settling her into the chair as the warmth wrapped around her like a second embrace. The wolf curled up at her feet, its injured side pressed gently against her boots, as if it needed her closeness as much as she needed theirs. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the past in white, hiding the bodies and the fear. Inside, the air was quiet except for the pop of the logs, the deep breaths they shared, and the faint sigh she let out when his hand stayed on hers. For the first time since the beating, since the fear, since the cold had crept into her bones, she felt it. The absolute, unshakable certainty that she was home.